Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. Especially if you're hoping to find out the skinny on developer The Parasights, archery-oriented action-adventure Blacktail, which sees you diving headlong into the dark forests of Slavic folklore in search of a lost sibling. That said, did Parasights Project hit the bullseye, or did this grim fairy tale fall short of the mark? I'm your host Arlyeon. Let's find out together. Now, premise-wise, Blacktail puts you in the shoes of a young Yaga, a withdrawn girl who chooses to take refuge behind a mask due to a certain blemish, which is a complicated decision since it leads to a fair bit of bullying from her peers, at least until the village youth begin to disappear. As the days trickle by and more children vanished, the tensions continue to intensify, and yet through it all, she had her sister Zora, until the black woods swallowed her too and forced Yaga to venture after her in search of clues, despite Baba's shadow still looming over those Fey wilds. Whilst this is a relatively simple premise, the game doesn't really waste much time wrapping you up in its mythology, with a flashback sequence soon giving way to the present and the central back and forth that tells a lot of the story. Namely, Yaga and the mysterious voice that accompanies her, providing a combination of snark and support in her efforts to find some semblance of truth as to what happened to her sister and the other children of the village. It also allows a fair bit of running commentary both as you roam about the wilderness and progress through your quests, and just overall provides a companion of sorts to offset Yaga, especially as she's faced with the increasing absurdity of the residents of the woods. Something which proves inescapable as she becomes increasingly immersed in their outlandish intrigues. Admittedly, said intrigues are often optional, but they actually took up the majority of my time spent in Blacktail, if only because they provided some fairly fun stabs at folklore and helped to flesh things out at large. Seriously, it was pretty rewarding to see the journal fill up with lore as I discovered bits of knowledge, found totems, and even fished up fairy tale-esque objects to learn the darker truths of each story. That said, I'm not really kidding when I said they took up the majority of my time, given that whenever I focused on the main storyline, I found myself able to zip through those segments in a relatively timely fashion, barely touching on each expansive zone they occupied. Which, speaking of skimming over, while Blacktail does boast a morality system, you shouldn't be overly concerned about the sort of consequences it'll have narratively. It's somewhat divorced from having any real story impact. The optional quests will still play out regardless of your choices, with the main difference being who's doling out the quest and the characters which drive it forward. Ultimately, the outcomes still boil down to a pair of binary decisions and don't have much impact on what comes next, with the biggest boon being more of a mechanical benefit for picking sides, insofar as whatever reputation perks are provided to you. And since we're getting on to the mechanical, we may as well tackle the experience that is playing Blacktail. Essentially, it's an action-adventure that tasks you with roaming the countryside, following a literal trail of breadcrumbs in search of the missing children. While this sounds relatively simple, there's a few things which complicate the matter, the foremost of which is the sheer unrelenting hostility of the world. Seriously, it's hard to run a few steps without something wanting a piece of you, which is a bit of a problem since not only are the enemies not exactly fragile as you progress forward, they're more than capable of shearing through your initially limited health. What's more, you have limited ammo reserves you'll need to continually craft on the fly, and enemy groups are often placed fairly close to each other to the point that your attempts at maneuvering around to get space to attack will frequently lead to triggering even more enemies to come say hi. That's not to say running isn't an option, you're pretty swift, especially when you put your bow away, but even without factoring in the issue of triggering more enemies, it takes a substantial amount of distance to de-aggro an enemy, which is a problem since you're unable to interact with save points, treasure chests, or NPCs during this time, and can often lead to you acquiring some substantial trains of enemies. And that's then made worse because if by chance you happen to die and haven't been able to save for a while because you aggroed a whole bunch of things, it'll reset you to whenever the last super sporadic autosave kicked in, or the last time you had the resources to spend a flower at a shrine in order to manually save. And I specify the resources because those flowers also double as crafting materials, both for recipes and the potions you'll need to craft to, say, cure all the poison you're going to be afflicted with if you're not careful. And for further insult to injury, hitting checkpoints and saving doesn't heal you to full. It heals you an almost laughable amount of health that'll get sheared off in one hit. Tops, because you won't even need to leave the first area before you stumble across enemies capable of 1 or 2 shotting you if you decide to nose around. It actually got to the point that exploring about the regions felt more restrictive than rewarding, since the sheer number of enemies I'd accidentally trigger, often while I was trying to dodge between the attacks of another enemy group, was just aggravating. And then compounded when I'd end up bumbling into enemies the game didn't warn me I'd be unable to kill until near the end. Enemies which in early side quests literally sent me in a collision course with, like some sort of sadistic gag, made worse when I realized how much fucking damage these effectively unkillable assholes were. Really, the best I could hope for was surviving. And to Yagi's credit, she's not the worst at it. I mean, yes, she's fragile, but she has a decent dash at her disposal, a fairly accessible knockback spell you get access to very early on, and most importantly, she gets a broom. The broom is pretty much your lifeline for a good portion of the game, given it literally forces enemies to ignore you and attack it, allowing you the leisure of rapid-firing shots into the crowd or charging up a shot and ventilating the back of a Gnoll's skull. That said, her Hocus, the attack spell she gets, is somewhat mediocre comparatively. It doesn't do much damage, with its main highlight being that it can lock enemies in place, at least on the good morality path. That said, the paralysis it inflicts isn't actually enough for you to switch to your bow and then shoot someone. What's more, the charged arrow spell is alright for dealing with crowds, but I actually found that it was the spell I gained in the second act, the Poison Veil, that did enough damage and was just situationally useful enough for my liking, specifically by poisoning everything and especially bosses. Which is probably why, in hindsight, I'd legitimately suggest not poking your nose too deeply into the various regions until you've completed the second act, since by that juncture you'll have acquired all the various types of arrows you'll need to deal with the enemies, and explore the world, screw you crystal enemies and obstacles, as well as gained the necessary movement abilities to get around properly, such as the delightful ability to teleport between markers by shooting them. The latter's especially nice for getting away from trains of enemies trying to kill you, and utterly irreplaceable insofar as reaching a large number of secrets. It also means you won't find yourself accidentally platforming into an area where there's no real way of getting yourself back out short of throwing yourself off a cliff or into the drink, because that is legitimately a thing that happened to me because of platforming and this game being a little quirky. And yes, the whole jumping into the drink is the solution, I don't mean because I swam out. I mean because Yaga's about as adept at swimming as a cinder block, and she'll just wash up to the nearest shore after falling in water, albeit at the verge of death. And also on the subject of janky exploration, you can expect a number of invisible walls and odd segments where it looks like you should be able to platform, but simply can't. While the game does minimize these segments the further in you get, you'll definitely bump into them if you're inclined towards stupid platforming in attempting to find secrets. Which is also how I wound up encountering a number of absolutely awful bugs in the final area of the game, and repeatedly fell off the map. I'm actually not even sure how the hell it happened either, but at some point the map design just completely hit a brick wall for me and went to pieces, because the final segment of the game just saw me getting repeatedly stuck in places with no way out save for the option of resetting. Which is a large shame, because by that juncture I'd started to warm up to the experience despite the rough start. Sure, the morality system felt a little bit rough narratively speaking, but I didn't mind doing the optional tasks to gain experience towards them, especially as ramping up started to provide me some legitimately useful bonuses, like tweaking my abilities or allowing me to passively gather more resources, and the reputation-related titles were an especially nice bonus since they helped me navigate the world in peace without being attacked by fireflies, and just made grinding good reputation faster. What's more, once I'd gotten my full kit, exploring the world didn't feel as punishing. Like I said before, the side quests that you're granted provide some fairly solid obstacles to overcome, and once you have those tools, there's some legitimately neat side bosses they build up to with some actually fun rewards. I'm not kidding about how good those feel either, since there's a large number of optional recipes to find, and this latter element is important since recipes serve as character upgrades that you can craft at Yule Baba Hut once you have the blueprint and materials needed. While some of these are on the main path, like the recipe to craft other arrows, other things are comparatively well hidden, like boosting the damage of your wooden arrows, improved dashes, or even improvements to your magic. What's more important, they also grant access to hexes. See, to gain a hex, you have to craft 3 recipes of a type associated with that hex. And this actually ends up being pretty important because the hexes function as specializations for your character, being better at the use and storage of certain arrows, as well as providing you small attribute bonuses, which help to make them a bit more efficient overall. Which really helps to flesh out the kind of Yaga that you want to play as. What's more, to the game's credit, it's not actually that taxing to reach the hut in order to use and craft these recipes, since there's a handy fast travel system to bounce between wherever the Black Cat's hanging out, and since you have a useful fast travel system in the form of the Black Cat that's hanging about the map, it lets you teleport between where he is and the hub, allowing you just to upgrade whenever you found the necessary ingredients, though that's the extent of its kindness on that front, as you're able to return to where the cat was, but you can't actually choose to go to any of the other points he's on the map, even if you've already visited there. Again, thank God you run so fast without the bow equipped. But here's the thing, even with all the enjoyment I was finally getting out of being able to actually do the content it had to offer and to explore the far reaches of the world, I rapidly found myself hitting a brick wall, and that road to ruin wasn't even when things broke in the 4th act. Oh no, the game actually started to break long before then in the 3rd act when the main quest simply stopped progressing. I found and beat the boss for that area, I got the next cutscene to advance the game, and it even provided me access to the final area and started to do dialogue, but the game was still trying to direct me back to the boss I'd just beaten. No matter how many times I patrolled the area or searched for some object to interact with, or the like, there was nothing. I'd already done what I needed to do, it was just busted. And whilst I'd considered running through the game again on a corrupt save file just to see what the other path was like deeper in, I rather quickly came face to face with another problem. Namely, you can't actually choose save slots, with them being allocated automatically as you use save shrines between 4 slots, and an autosave, which meant I could only progress so far so many times before it wiped out the file I'd spent 20 hours in, unless I was wanting to swap back and forth between the files, managing my saves in a judicious manner just so I could progress forward in a corrupt playthrough. It's pretty awful, actually. Like, sure, I got to try out the story mode, and yes, it was substantially less painful than the base game, with more forgiving heals and what seemed to be less incoming damage and more resources gathered. But that wasn't enough to warrant gambling my save on, which is a shame, because even if the game's narrative didn't actually change much during the 2nd playthrough, I was enjoying the process of going through it. The music in this game is quite good, and it really helps to hit the dramatic notes for the given scenes, which is then accompanied by some very solid voice acting. I think, in fact, that was the most rewarding element of swapping factions for me, was I got to hear all these different lines for the quests and for Yaga as she was exploring through the world. And speaking of characters, this game itself is gorgeous. Like, I'm not doing the game credit with my current PC and video card, it's a lot lovelier on the higher settings, really helping to make the world feel lush and to allow you to see the details of your enemies and allies. But a pretty package doesn't quite... Well, okay, here's the thing. There really isn't that much variety in the overall arrangement of enemies, which makes the overall denseness of combat feel tedious. Yes, there's some slight permutations on what's there, but a lot of it just feels repetitive once you've gotten through the first 2 acts, with very little new things being introduced. The optional content helps somewhat on this front, as the bosses it provides are decent encounters and help to mix things up, especially given the flavor and humor involved in some of the missions, but even then there's some repetition, though nowhere to the degree of the central story bosses, which feel extremely similar, especially once you start rushing from encounter to encounter. frankly, it made me sort of happy that there was at least a weird cat minigame you could engage with just to help take my mind off things and to make me suffer versus Pac-Man-ish purgatory. That and the end of chapter minigames, which provide some fairly novel and interesting gameplay segments all of their own, and help to provide me a little bit more reputation grind if I did well during them. But honestly, even if the game hadn't broken and I did gain access to NG+, I'm not sure I would have been that keen on going through it all over again, since, again, it doesn't actually change things up that much, and I'd wind up losing access to all my items or recipes I'd unlocked beyond the collectible teeth materials I'd accrued over the game. A resource I'd found in excess of to begin with, and which hinges on the aforementioned no longer there crafting recipes. Honestly, it's just a crying shame, really, because even with the lack of morality making a real splash narratively, the actual storyline itself had me pretty invested in seeing Blacktail to its end and finding out more about its world and what it was building up to. Each new revelation, each new question it posed and teased at, and just the overarching weirdness of it was a lot of build up for me to just get blocked at the end. Blocked after a very rough start, like I said, and normally a game like this I'd probably call a fumble, because I do think it would appeal to some people with all of its story and the gameplay it does offer once you get past that initial segment, even with the rough edges and the overall jank, such as continually running into things like enemies disappearing and shooting projectiles at you, or floating into the sky while shooting projectiles at you. Yes, that is a thing. You'd occasionally just hit an enemy and they just sort of unperson, but they'd still be there, which was a huge problem because then you couldn't interact with anything until you ran a mile away from the location they'd vanished into. But here's the thing. Regardless of whatever kernels of fondness the game had managed to evoke, the experience culminated in it being so utterly broken that I can't even finish it. Hell, I even somehow managed to piece together some of the stuff I needed to do in the very final area while everything was bugged, and all I'd managed to do was then semi-solve a puzzle that culminated in it being broken because the quests weren't progressing. And it's for that reason that I have to rate this game a fail. I actually tried to contact the developer to report my problems, and I heard nothing back. I usually try to give developers a fair shake to get back to me about bugs. I've reported mine, I've heard nothing back. Hopefully at some point in the future, some of these rough edges will get ironed out and the game will hit a point where it'll be able to be completed in a consistent manner. But for now, I'm not sure I would recommend this game to anyone in this state. Also, it's really painful that there's a cooking minigame that you can't fail and which forces me to make steaks well done. I wanted them rare. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description. And to my Patreon, so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. And to my Twitch, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live. That said, I'll catch y'all in the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.